Hey everyone, welcome back. So, have you ever wondered if an entire field of science could literally be put on trial? Well, in today's explainer, we're doing exactly that. We're diving into a fascinating, decades-old debate surrounding evolutionary psychology and its ultimate scientific test, falsifiability. It's one of those topics that sparks intense debate in academic halls, and today we're going to look directly at the evidence to see how science actually evaluates complex claims about human nature. To really understand this trial, we have to rewind a bit to the 1970s. The renowned paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould threw down a pretty heavy critique. He famously claimed that, quote, virtuosity in invention had replaced testability as the criterion for acceptance. Basically, he was accusing these researchers of relying on untestable, campfire just-so stories to explain human behavior, rather than hard, measurable evidence. And you know what? It's a pervasive academic myth that still lingers today. All right, so here's our roadmap for unpacking all of this. We'll start with the unfalsifiability critique, move on to the Lakatosian framework, look at Exhibit A with falsifying dual meaning, explore why misconceptions persist, and finally deliver the verdict on competing theories. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the unfalsifiability critique. Now, to be totally fair to critics like Gould and Richard Lewontin back in the 70s, there really was a lack of rigorous empirical research in the field at that time. Their demand for better evidence was completely valid. But what does it actually mean to hold a science to a rigorous standard? Well, it all comes down to falsifiability, a concept popularized by the philosopher Karl Popper back in 1959. Notice the absolutely crucial word here, prohibitive. For a hypothesis to be considered real science, it has to generate specific prohibitive predictions, meaning if the theory is true, it explicitly forbids certain things from happening. If we go out and observe those forbidden things, boom, the theory is logically contradicted. It's falsified. Which brings us to Section 2, the Lakatosian scientific framework. You see, Popper's strict binary rule, where one single failed prediction just nukes an entire theory, is actually a bit oversimplified for complex sciences. Modern evolutionary psychology actually operates on the Lakatosian model of scientific progress. This model focuses on how a research program adapts and refines its theories when anomalies inevitably pop up. Think of it like a hierarchical ladder. At the very top, you have the grand meta-theory of evolution by natural selection. Just below that are middle-level evolutionary theories, like the theory of parental investment. From there, researchers derive specific hypotheses, which then finally generate those highly testable specific predictions at the very bottom. And this structure is brilliant because it protects the core theories. Let's walk down those steps for a second. If a specific prediction at step 4 totally fails an empirical test, we don't just jump all the way back up to step 1 and throw out the entire concept of evolution. That would be crazy. Instead, those middle-level theories act as a kind of protective belt. We adjust our auxiliary assumptions, we refine the hypothesis, and we test it again. It's literally the hallmark of progressive science. But this naturally begs the question, what actually happens when an evolutionary prediction fails? Do researchers just sweep it under the rug, or do they hold themselves to that strict standard of falsifiability we just talked about? To answer that, we really need to put evolutionary psychology to the ultimate test with a real-world case study. Let's look at Section 3, Exhibit A, falsifying dual mated. If we're going to see if this field is actually falsifiable, we need a massive, high-profile test case. Enter the dual mating hypothesis. This proposed that while women generally seek long-term resource investment from a committed partner, they might also seek genetic benefits, so-called good genes, via short-term mating opportunities, specifically during their fertile ovulatory phase. The prediction here was incredibly specific. Women should show heightened, shifting preferences for masculine, symmetrical traits exactly during their fertile window to secure superior genetic fitness. Conceptually, it was an elegant, incredibly testable idea. So that was the clear expectation, but reality had other plans. When this was subjected to large-scale rigorous replications, the data just fell apart. A massive meta-analysis of 58 studies by Wood and colleagues found absolutely zero significant preference for these traits during the fertile phase. Precise hormone tracking studies confirmed there was no shift. And on top of that, genetic data looking back through history shows that extra-pair paternity or cuckoldry rates are actually extremely low, hovering at just 1 to 2%. So, the verdict is in. The dual mating hypothesis is overwhelmingly unsupported in its original form. And honestly, here is the absolute most important part of this whole exhibit. evolutionary psychologists, including some of the very originators of the hypothesis, looked at that data and conceded that it failed. They didn't try to hide the results, they adjusted their understanding based on empirical refutation. It proves unequivocally that the field holds itself to strict, falsifiable standards.
Moving into Section 4, why misconceptions persist. So if we've just seen crystal clear evidence that evolutionary psychology actively discards failed hypotheses, why do so many 21st century academics still buy into the myth that it's unfalsifiable? Well, it boils down to three intuitive leaps that critics tend to make. First, they argue that because behavior doesn't fossilize, we simply can't verify the past. Second, they claim that any observation is automatically a just-so story. And third, they assume that having competing hypotheses is just a sneaky way of moving the goalposts. Let's rapid-fire debunk these right now.
First up, the time machine myth. Critics say we can't directly verify the ancestral past, so the science is impossible. But the reality is, we don't need a time machine. We test modern psychological design features. The design of the human mind today is essentially a collection of living fossils. For example, we don't have to literally travel back in time to test if the human disgust system evolved to protect us against disease. We can test right now if modern humans show a systematic, functional relationship between disgust sensitivity and specific pathogen cues. And guess what? The data shows they absolutely do.
Second is the just-so story myth. Yes, sometimes researchers use reverse engineering. They observe a modern trait and hypothesize its evolutionary function. But observing a trait doesn't make it a just-so story, not if it forces you to generate strict, novel predictions. Here's a great example. Researchers observed men's preference for specific lumbar curvature in women. They hypothesized this was an adaptation to handle the intense biomechanical stress of ancestral pregnancy. That generated a very strict prediction. The preferred angle should be exactly 45.5 degrees to optimize weight redistribution without causing spinal injury. They tested it, and it was perfectly confirmed. That is rigorous biomechanical science, guys, not some campfire story.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the verdict on competing theories.
We've firmly established that evolutionary psychology makes falsifiable predictions and completely accepts empirical defeat when the data demands it. But how does this track record compare to its harshest theoretical critics? Well, take biosocial role theory as a major competing framework. It confidently predicted that as societies achieve greater gender equality, psychological and behavioral sex differences will just naturally diminish or disappear entirely. But empirical reality proved the exact opposite. We now have what's widely known as the gender equality paradox. In highly egalitarian societies, places like Norway and Sweden, psychological sex differences, especially in personality and occupational choices, actually grow larger, not smaller.
What we're looking at here is a glaringly uneven application of falsification. While evolutionary psychology openly discards failed hypotheses, exactly like we saw with the dual mating hypothesis, competing theorists rarely concede when their core predictions are soundly refuted. When faced with that gender equality paradox, instead of accepting falsification, some frameworks rely on post hoc rationalizations. They try to argue that somehow these highly egalitarian societies must secretly harbor even stronger gender stereotypes behind the scenes. So I'm going to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. If competing theories flat out refuse to accept their own empirical falsification, even when the data explicitly contradicts them, why is evolutionary psychology uniquely put on trial for being unfalsifiable? It really makes you completely rethink how scientific rigor is applied and sometimes misapplied across the academic spectrum. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today in this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.